Hello, in this lesson you'll learn how to use ACSS variables. We've already covered these two aspects of ACSS in depth, default styling and classes. So here you're going to learn how to use variables to take your use of ACSS to another level. Here I'll first quickly explain the basics of how you use variables, then you'll see examples of why variables are so useful. Lots of benefits. And finally, I'm going to walk through some examples of when you might be best using classes and when it's best to use variables. So the basics to start with. The big question, what are variables? Unlike classes, which you set on an entire element, you use variables for individual style settings. Quick example, I've selected this heading element, it's set to H2, but let's say I want it to display at H1 size instead. In ACSS, I could add a class to do this. Refer to the cheat sheet if you've forgotten, but that's H -- and then 1 in this case. So that's a class, and you've created and added classes hundreds of times now, both your own custom classes and ACSS's pre-built ones. Whereas variables, you set on individual style settings. You're going to learn what the big benefit of this is shortly, but here's a quick example. If I come into typography, in font size, variables always follow the same pattern, var, and then open and close brackets. Inside those brackets, -- and then, in this case, H1. Yep, same end result. The font size is set to the same as H1. Or what about if we wanted the font size to be, say, the extra large text size? Okay, well, just get rid of the H1 bit. The variable for extra large text is text XL. Get the idea? Let's come to the cheat sheet and see how I knew what variables to use there. So here I've filtered down to text sizes. In fact, let's see only the classes. So you're familiar with these already, the heading and text t-shirt sizes. Now just variables. See, same styles but as variables instead. var, 2 brackets with -- and the style name. Okay, so you know that variables are for individual style settings and that there are often matching variables for classes. Like we had all the heading and text size classes and then a set of matching variables. That is not always the case. Sometimes there are classes without matching variables and vice versa. But why variables? Well, there are some big benefits to variables, and this is where ACSS has an advantage over a lot of other class-based frameworks. Let's look back at our site. Take these two cards. So we added our own custom class, if you remember, DF card. And I used that to set the rounded corners. And we also added some ACSS classes as well, white background, content gap, large padding, all benefiting from ACSS's calculations and scaling. Or another example, the testimonial blocks. Again, we added our own custom class, DF home testimonial. We used that to set some of our own styles like centering on the cross axis. And then up in style, we also made the text white, centered the text, set a background color on it, set a border radius as well. But we also added some ACSS classes as well, like medium padding, standard content gap, small text, again, to take advantage of everything ACSS does for us automatically. And adding ACSS classes like this is absolutely the way that you use most class-based frameworks. You just keep adding classes for whatever styles you need. But you'll probably remember there are two big problems. One, it's tedious and repetitive when you're actually building the thing. So when you have multiple elements with the same style, like these 3 testimonial blocks, you have to add the same classes to every one of them. Pad M on this one, pad M on this one, pad M on this one, and repeat for the content gap and the text size and whatever else. And 2, it can make future maintenance a bit of a nightmare. So let's say later you decide actually you want these testimonials to have large padding instead. What would you have to do? Well, you'd have to go and remove the pad M class from the first block and then add a new pad L class instead, and then do the same on the next one and the same on the next one. But worse still, if you have this style of testimonials all over the site, well, you'd have to go and do the same on all of those as well. So there's nothing wrong with adding multiple classes to elements to style them. You know, sometimes you're still thrashing out the design, and it's easier to just pop classes on and see what they look like. And sometimes it is actually more appropriate to use classes. A good example is grids. So in a lot of cases, it's probably better to just slap on a main grid class, a breakpoint grid class, and a grid gap class. I'm going to cover when to use classes or variables later in this lesson. But in cases like our testimonial blocks, we could actually roll each of these 3 ACSS classes into one single class. We already made one anyway, df home testimonial. It's very often better to actually just create your own single custom class and set all the styles as variables instead. That just means you have only one class to add to the other blocks and only one class to update if you decide to change the styling of the block site-wide. Let's do it. So in df home testimonial, well, remember again, we already set align cross axis center. Let's replace the pad_m class. I'll remove it. Oh, actually, I'm going to have to remove it from the other 2 blocks as well. Now select the df home testimonial class to style it. It's padding, so padding is in layout. And all we do is add the padding values here instead as variables. Now there's something very important to understand about setting paddings and margins with variables. You see, with padding and margin classes, they have to have either margin or padding in the name. For obvious reasons, the classes are preset to either set margin or padding. But with variables, you're adding the value directly to either the padding or margin style settings on the element. So all you actually need is a space variable instead. See, it says here, it sets space, padding, margin or gaps to whatever t-shirt size it is. So let's come back. In padding, link all the sides. Remember it was medium padding that we had before, so here we want the space medium variable. So that's var, open and close brackets, dash dash, always the same format. And then it's just space m. That's it. And of course, all 3 blocks have updated because they all have the same class on them. Easy. By the way, you can make it easier to type variables with a text expander tool. So for example, you might use text expander itself, which I used for ages way back. Or if you're on a Mac, there is now a keyboard text expander feature built in. You can find that in System Prefs and Keyboard, and then into the Text tab. You just type here a quick version that you want to type, like semicolon var, for instance. I start all my snippets with a semicolon just because I'm not going to otherwise start any normal words with a semicolon. Some people use commas or things like that. And then here you just put what you want it to expand out to. So that will be the full version, var, open and close brackets, and dash dash. However, I've personally used Alfred on Mac for over 10 years now, and they have a similar feature. Same thing, again, the keyword here, I decided on semicolon var, and it'll expand out to this. I'll show you on the site. So I'll type semicolon var, and that's it. And now all I have to do is just type the actual variable. Makes it really fast to add variables. Let's do the rest. Text size next. I'll remove that text size class from all 3 blocks. Select the class again. Text size is in typography, of course. So I'll use my text snippet, semicolon var, and text s. And now remove content gap. Do that on all 3. The elements are all back crushed together now, reunited after all this time. Alright, select the class once more. I have mentioned before that all the gap classes, like content gap, container gap, grid gap, they use the gap value in either flex or grid. So this block is set to display flex. And of course it's row gap we want because we want a gap between each row, meaning each element. And that one is just var content gap. And now we're back to just one class to further style later on if we like, one class to add anywhere else, and one class to edit later. I'm going to leave you to do the same with the 2 cards. We already have a class, df card. The white background class, you could lose that and just add it to the background instead on the class. And content gap and large padding, well, you know what to do. So when do I decide to use classes? Well, as I've said already, I always do that with the grid classes. You see, if I select the home hero container, it's actually much easier to pop grid classes on to handle the grid and the responsive breakpoints. Here though, I would use a variable for the large width on this container, so I'll remove that class. I'll style this class df home hero container. You might remember we created that to align the columns vertically centered. Width is in layout, as you know, and the variable is widthL. So now on this container we have the ACSS grid classes and then one custom class of our own, where we can put all our other styles. The other element that I always use classes for are buttons, like this one. This button was button action. You see, there's a lot going on with button styling. A button class sets various colours and sizes and backgrounds and everything. It is much easier and more appropriate to use a class for buttons. And also, I use an ACSS class if I only need to add one style to an element, like only a text size or only a content gap. Usually, I just add one ACSS class and move on. I don't bother creating a custom class and using variables. Like, say, this rich text. If I wanted to make it text large, if there were no other styles on it, like there isn't here, I'd probably just stick a class of text --L on it and leave it at that. Now, obviously, if later I came back and wanted to add more styles to the element, then I would probably then remove that class, create my own custom class, and use variables on it instead. Much easier to manage. Okay, so I'm going to leave you to improve the page by swapping out those classes for variables instead. And in the next lesson, we'll tackle the boss level of ACSS, Pro Mode. See you there soon.